All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. This is the Fall Psychological Science and the Public Good event, and this one is called Applying Psychological Science in the Era of COVID-19. We have a number of speakers today who are going to talk about exciting research they've been working on in the era of COVID. And we also have a number of other individuals in the department who are doing interesting work in this space. So we may have additional opportunities to talk about this. Before we get started on the event this evening, I want to acknowledge how difficult and just extraordinarily trying these times are for everyone. And how talking about the coronavirus and its impacts may be very difficult to do. It may be especially difficult for individuals who have been individually impacted by this virus in their families or themselves, and also recognizing that this virus has disproportionately affected communities. In context of that, I would also like to recognize that the socio-political climate that we are in is disproportionately impacting many of our communities. I would also like to point out, though, while we are having that conversation, that many of our communities, including communities of color, have been extraordinarily resilient in this difficult time and across the past months and years and decades. And so as we think about differential impact and the negative consequences of disparities, it's important to recognize that the individuals and communities themselves are extraordinarily resilient. And while that should not be necessary, while it shouldn't be something that we expect or that the circumstances require, it is in fact the reality. And so while we work to challenge and break apart and mitigate the effects of inequity, we need to keep in mind that while we do that, we are in the company of extraordinarily resilient individuals. So what we're going to do today is we're going to hear from three of our really fantastic scientific groups who have been working on trying to bring scientific understanding to bear on the coronavirus and its impact on our communities in the world. And I think one thing I wanted to highlight for all of us is that two of the things that are captured in this particular event are two of our most powerful weapons and antidotes to this very difficult set of circumstances. One is science, right? Knowledge is how we move forward. And the types of work that people are doing here really give us a chance to leverage the science that we have had, decades of science on stress and adversity and its impacts and what to do about it. But relatedly, this event is really our time where we come together to share knowledge that's generated in an academic setting across sectors, and really think about real engagement with the public around what we know and what we don't know, what we can do about it. So the community building aspect of this particular event, and it's as has been true across many years, and hopefully moving many years forward, is another way that we can really work together in these kinds of times. So community and science being two of our most powerful weapons and anecdotes are what we're doing here tonight. And we were joking a little bit, the panelists, before we got started, but this is an event we usually have snacks and drinks and get to stand around and chat and look at posters and interact with each other. It will be harder, of course, for us to interact in this particular forum. We are going to use the Q&A feature, so you can go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box. We will take questions after each speaker, and then we will have time at the end as well. So as your questions come to you, feel free to just go ahead and drop them in the Q&A section. But if you would like to pour a glass of wine or get some water or get a snack and be in the spirit of what we normally do during this time when we are together, I would encourage you to do that and enjoy the evening together, even though we are doing so virtually. So I'm going to give you just like 2 minutes to do that in case you want to grab something, and then I will introduce our first speaker, Dr. Jenna Doom. 2 minutes to get your snack, okay? And then we'll come back in shortly. A pear martini, Pam, is a little bit of an upgrade from what we usually have at this event. So I'm impressed. I don't even know how one would make that. All right, I hope you were able to get a snack and a beverage and you're ready to dive into the science. Our first speaker this evening will be Dr. Jenna Doom, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology. She joined us after doing her postdoctoral work at the University of Michigan, and before that, her doctoral work at the University of Minnesota. She is a vibrant, engaged scholar, and I think you will very much enjoy hearing about her research. And of course, she does not only do research on COVID, but it does dovetail really nicely with her broad expertise, which is about how stress impacts well-being, particularly for youth, and looking across both psychological factors and impacts and buffers, and also cardiovascular health. So I will turn it over to Dr. Doom, and you can never miss an opportunity to say Dr. Doom. I will turn it over to Dr. Doom and let her take it away here.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Let me share my screen. Great, so I am excited to talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing with adolescents and specifically high schoolers during the COVID-19 pandemic. So even before COVID, teen mental health has just been getting worse. So this graph shows episodes of major depression from 2004 up to 2016, showing an increase in major depressive episodes for youth and also in major depressive episodes with severe impairment. And it's important to note that many are not getting the mental health treatment that they need. So even so they have depression, but less than half are actually getting the treatment that they need. Girls typically have higher rates of depression than boys, but again, for both boys and girls, they're not getting the treatment. So even before COVID, there was already this mental health crisis for teenagers. So some of the national COVID-19 teen mental health data has shown that about 7 out of 10 teenagers report struggling with their mental health during COVID, and about 50% report difficulties with anxiety, and about 40% report excess stress and symptoms of depression. So this is already maybe escalating what we're already seeing with this mental health crisis for teens. So we wanted to dig a little bit further. And what we wanted to do was to work with high schoolers and to see really what was going on, to see if there was anything that we might be able to intervene on to maybe either improve mental health or maybe prevent new cases of depression. So what we did was we worked with 3 high schools, and students were recruited from these 3 high schools in the Midwestern and Western United States. So teachers sent out an online survey that we had them complete. So the first school is a large public school. We also worked with a small public school and then a private school. And 654 students from these 3 schools ended up finishing our survey. And for context, this survey was done in early May of 2020, and these were all urban high schools. So this was during the kind of stay-at-home part of the pandemic for all 3 high schools. So all school was online, and really was leaving the home was really limited for high school students. So the first thing that we did with this survey was asking students what their challenges were. So 3 individuals in or affiliated with my lab, Sam Scott, Kenya Rivera, and Ella Rushing, coded some data that we got from these 654 high school students. And we asked them, what are your 3 biggest challenges right now? So instead of like imposing our thoughts onto them, we asked them, what are you really dealing with right now? And what we found was that the challenge that students most reported was having trouble with online schooling. So trouble with academics, being motivated in school, setting up good habits for schooling at home. Around a quarter of students reported that this was one of their 3 biggest challenges. The next highest thing that was reported was mental health struggles. So 15% reported different types of mental health struggles broadly. The third was a little surprising. So about 13% reported difficulties with physical health and health behaviors. And this is not like they got COVID and they were really sick. That was a separate category, either like being concerned about COVID or having COVID, that very few people reported. This was more, I'm just not feeling as physically well. I am not getting very good sleep. I'm not able to exercise as much, or I'm eating too much or too little, or not very good food. So this came up fairly often in our sample. And then the next most highest reported category was friendships. So students were saying, I'm really having difficulty maintaining good friendships during this. And that was a real struggle for teens in our survey. So we also asked a bit more about depression. So we had a screener that is a 2-question screener called the PHQ-2, and it's a kind of screener for probable depression. And what we found was that actual 47% of those 654 students met criteria for major depressive disorder based on that screener. 73% said that they had felt down, depressed, or hopeless at least several days in the past 2 weeks. And just to give you an idea of how this is compared to normal rates, the typical 12 months depression rate for teens is about 11 to 13%. So this was about 3 times the rate we would expect in a normal year for teenagers, is what we were seeing in May of this pandemic, when the biggest shutdowns were taking place. We found that students were really lonely. So about 83% said they at least some of the time felt isolated from others. 77% felt that they lacked companionship, and 61% felt that they at least some of the time felt left out. We also asked what was different during the pandemic from before the pandemic. The thing that was reported the most is using a lot more social media right now. So 83% said they were using more social media, 82% said they were more bored. They were feeling less connected to school and to their teachers, feeling lonelier, stressed, less motivated to do well in school, and also more anxious. So big changes from before the pandemic. We also asked what kind of concerns they had. And the thing that was reported most often was not seeing friends in person, then having a family member that might get sick, then having to stay at home, having conflict with parents, sibling conflicts between parents. Actually, only a third reported being really concerned about getting sick at this point. So much more concern for friends and family, for themselves. But we also saw quite a few concerns about the family not having enough money, or them not having enough to eat, 20% and 8% respectively. So a wide variety of concerns. There were also some positives. So we asked if coronavirus affected their life in a positive way at all. And about 69% said that they were actually able to get more sleep and saw that as a positive. Over half said they felt positive about spending more time with their family, but also having reduced schoolwork, more time on the computer. And then also just about a third said that not having to deal with kids at school was also a positive too. So these are kind of some of the things that we learned from that May survey. And from that May survey, we decided, what did we learn about what teens are going through. Are there any potential targets for an intervention that we could deliver in schools to either to maybe prevent new cases of depression, maybe help with well-being or mental health overall? So from this survey in May, we decided on a couple of different intervention targets. So we identified 2 potential intervention targets. So this was with me and my collaborator, Dr. Chris Rozek at WashU in St. Louis. And we decided that 2 of the main ones were this social or school belonging. So this feeling like, I'm a part of my school, I belong in my school, I belong with the other students. And then the second is theories of emotion, which I'll get into and explain a little bit more. So we kind of chose these 2 potential intervention targets. The first was that belonging, and we decided to use this because students who had lower school belonging were more likely to have that probable of depression on that screener than students with higher school belonging. So it was about 62% had depression in that low belonging group versus about 40% in that higher school belonging group. So what we did was we adapted an existing social school belonging intervention to the COVID pandemic. So a lot of the examples that were given in the original were things like, things that happened during school. Whereas, if you're not actually in school and you're an online school, or if you're at home a lot, you might have very, very different challenges. So we adapted this intervention to really normalize student struggles that students were having during the pandemic based on what we've kind of learned from the challenges questionnaire that we'd asked. And also just to show that it gets better over time. So it had a lot of quotes from students that we had created to kind of normalize things, show it gets better, and then also had some writing activities in it as well. And so this was a 2-part intervention. Both parts were about 20 minutes long and were delivered during school. So this 2-part intervention really targeted this kind of social and school belonging. The second intervention, or the second target, was this theories of emotion, which is this belief that students have about their emotions. So if you have a student who has a more growth theory of emotion, they have this thought that I can change and control my emotions. If I have really negative emotions, I can change them when it's appropriate and make them into more positive. And this belief about changing your emotions is actually associated with better student outcomes and especially mental health outcomes. And so students can also, some students can also have a fixed theory of emotion. So this is students who believe that emotions just happen to me and they can't be controlled. And this is something that's associated with worse student outcomes and poorer student mental health. And we decided on this as the second target for an intervention because it's associated with that depression screener. So students with that fixed theory of emotion who thought they can't change their emotions actually had about a 65% chance of scoring positive on that depression screener, whereas it was only 30% for those with that growth theory of emotion who thought that they could change their emotions when appropriate. So this was really strongly correlated with probable depressions. We wanted to use this as a potential target for intervention. So for the second intervention, this theories of emotion intervention, we similarly to the first one had this 2-part intervention. So each part was 20 minutes long, delivered completely online. And session 1 first taught students what emotions are, taught how they form, recognized when you're feeling different emotions, and recognizing that it's normal to have difficulties with regulating your emotions. In that second session, we learned more that it showed that people can modify their emotions, that you can improve your ability to change your emotions with practice, and that everyone can use emotion regulation to improve your well-being. And we really thought for both interventions that this could be, we hypothesized that this could be especially effective for more low-income students. And this is because low-income students are more likely to have depression and mental health struggles. They're also more likely to have a fixed theory of emotion, that they can't change their emotion. And they're also less likely to feel like they belong in school. So we thought that this intervention might particularly benefit students from low-income backgrounds. So to test these 2 interventions that we had adapted from successful interventions, but adapted them to more this COVID context, we did a randomized control trial of around 3,000 high school students. And these students completed a baseline mental health survey. We could see how they were doing at the beginning of the fall semester this year. They were then, for the second part, randomly assigned into either that theories of emotion or that school social belonging intervention. So that two-part intervention that were given a couple of weeks apart. And then they completed a follow-up survey, so about a 20-minute follow-up survey at the end to see whether it was affected, and that was completed before the 2020 election. And what we predicted, so generally depression increases in across adolescence and across the school year. So we did expect that on average, a student who did not complete an intervention would increase in depressive symptoms. So we broke up our group into the higher income and lower income, since we had specific hypotheses about that lower income group. And what we found was for that students from higher income background, and what we defined that as not qualifying for free or reduced school lunch, we found for both groups, they increased from baseline depressive symptoms to later on. So kind of as we would expect, it doesn't seem like there's any real differences between this belonging and theories of emotion intervention for our students from higher income backgrounds. But excitingly, we found that for students from a lower income group, those who did the theories of emotion intervention actually showed no increase in their levels of depressive symptoms over time. So that's, again, against what we would expect. We would expect something a little bit closer to that belonging intervention, where you show increases in depressive symptoms over time based on past data. So this seems like it could be an effective intervention, especially for lower income students, to decrease levels of depressive symptoms over time. And just graphed side by side, you see that students from higher income backgrounds tend to have these lower rates of depressive symptoms, and that lower income backgrounds tend to have higher rates. And again, we showed that really flattening of that rate of increase for that theories of emotion intervention for the low income students. So is this intervention curing depression? We think it is unlikely that it is actually curing depression. That would be pretty amazing for a 40-minute online intervention. So we don't think that's happening. Do we think it's preventing new cases of depression? That's kind of what we think is happening. And we could actually test that with our data. So for those who were depressed at time 1, we're not really seeing any big differences in change in their depressive symptoms at time 2. So really no group differences there. But for students that were not depressed at time 1, we saw big increases in depression for the students in that belonging intervention, but not for students in that theories of emotion intervention. So this really plays to the idea that this could be preventing new cases of depression at time 2 for the low income students on the in that theories of emotion intervention. So that theories of emotion intervention really decreased the total cases of major depressive disorder for low income students by about 25%, cut the number of new cases for those low income students by about half, which really isn't bad for a 40-minute totally free intervention that could be really given to any student with internet access. So we were pretty excited about these results, and we're hoping to replicate these hopefully in the spring. So why do we think this is happening? So are there maybe changes in social relationships that are also co-occurring? Are there maybe potential changes in the home environment that could be helping to reduce depression? So we found similar patterns. So we asked students how they felt about their relationships in general at the end of the intervention in that follow-up survey. And we found that students from lower income backgrounds who are in that theories of emotion intervention actually reported better relationships in general than those students in that belonging intervention. We found that this was also specific to your relationship with your caregiver. So you had higher feelings about your relationship with your caregiver for low income students who are in that theories of emotion intervention. And also we asked you, can you feel like you're yourself at home? Since we know that that's something that's related to both school performance and mental health. And what we found was that students from lower income backgrounds who are in that theories of emotion intervention actually had similar levels of feeling like they could be themselves at home compared to those students who were in those higher income groups. So that is all I have for you. I would like to thank all of the students, teachers, and administrators who made that research possible. And also for members of my lab, and also Dr. Rozek, who is my collaborator on this work. So thank you.
Great. So if you can go ahead and put your questions for Jenna in the Q&A section, that would be great.
It was scary. I couldn't see any of your faces, so I just had to hope that I was talking to a room full of people. It sounds like I was.
I definitely heard you. I'm wondering, okay, here comes one. Can you see it?
Yeah. Do you think it has anything to do with seasonal affective disorder? That could be part of it. So the question, if people can't see the Q&A, is depression increasing over the school year? Do you think that has anything to do with seasonal affective disorder? That could be part of it. This also increases across the entire school year. So generally, so even when you get into spring, they tend to increase as well. So I don't think it's entirely due to seasonal affective disorder, but I do think that could play a role for sure. Oh, thank you, Mr. Mahmood. One of our teachers at one of our schools is joining, so I'm excited that you're able to attend.
Jenna, I'll ask a verbal question. How does this this type of work intersect with your broader research program on how stress impacts youth physical health and overall health? Would you say, like, what do you think, if you map this on, is the impact of this particular line of work?
Great question. So we also, because I am interested in physical health, asked some questions about physical health and health behaviors. So that for low income students who were in that theories of emotion intervention, we also saw decreases in the amount of sugar sweetened beverages that they were drinking, that they reported drinking from the beginning of the school year to later. And we know that that's associated with obesity. They also reported just feeling better, so having better subjective physical health for low income students in that theories of emotion group. We ask things about like weight, how much exercise you're getting. So we're currently like coding those data right now and cleaning them so that we can see whether this is also applied to like exercise. We ask about how much sleep they're having. So we hypothesize that this is really important for depression, but we also know that depression is really closely tied to physical health as well. So I don't think that this is something that I think that we might see bigger effects with depression, but I don't think that this is something that is like solely affecting depression. I think it's something that is going to be a more broader health impact for both mental and physical health. So I'm excited to find out more about once we get more into the data. These are pretty preliminary results that I'm presenting, but hopefully I give you a little bit more about the physical health at a future time point. Based on why do you think these interventions had differential impacts based on income? So I think these interventions had differential impacts based on income. So so we didn't originally think about these interventions as like, we basically didn't have a control group because we found that students were struggling so much. And some of the schools we were working with said, like, we don't feel good about having a control group since schools are really struggling. And we agreed. We were like, yep, we understand. There's an ethical reason why we would want to give like 2 interventions and not a control group. So we gave these 2 interventions thinking that both would work, maybe on some different outcomes. But when we found that the theories of emotion intervention was really working better than the belonging intervention, we kind of thought about what was different about this theories of emotion intervention. And we, the social belonging one was really supposed to normalize struggles for our students that they're having and make them feel better. But the theories of emotion intervention it did that as well. It wasn't centered on that, but it also did that. And then it also added this extra piece of how to regulate your emotions when you're feeling really down or negative during COVID. So we think it had this kind of extra, maybe like reappraisal of what's going on and changes in this emotion. And we know that students from low income backgrounds are more likely to struggle with that and think that they can't change their emotions or have more trouble with emotion regulation. So that's one of the reasons that we think that theories of emotion intervention was different. And also, students from higher income backgrounds might not they might have some of those struggles, but it's less common for higher income students than the lower income students. So that's the first part of your question. Why might students from low income backgrounds feel like less likely they can be themselves than higher income students? And why do you think the theories of emotion intervention improved this for them specifically? That's a great question. So this is actually something I wish my collaborator were here for, because he's really interested in the thought that you can be yourself at home. I am not sure why lower income background students might feel like they can be less like themselves at home. Part of that could be because of low income families are more likely to experience, parents are experiencing a lot more stress. So we did see also, we had a kind of a subjective measure of SES where students who were reported being lower SES experienced a lot more stress. So part of that could be because lower income students are experiencing more stress at home. Maybe they're perceiving it to be less supportive and less likely that they can be themselves. And maybe parents are being a little bit less, maybe warm and accepting because they're under a lot of stress right now. So as a stress researcher, that's what I would say. My education researcher colleague might have a different answer, but that's kind of why I think maybe that reappraisal of what's going on at home might be really effective for those low income students.
Thank you, Jenna. Let's take Jill's question that's in the chat during the open question, so that we can move along here. So
that sounds great.
Great, thank you so much. Our next presenter is Dr. Alicia Davis, who is a full professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Denver and also a PI at the Conti Center at the University of California, Irvine, which is where she joined us from. But that's been quite some time now that we've been lucky enough to have her among us. She has quite a few really interesting lines of research, and she's going to be talking specifically about her COVID-19 work right now, but research on the impacts of stress during pregnancy on long-term outcomes in the kids that were in utero at the time. So following all the way out to adulthood now. And then I think they must be adults by now. And then also some really interesting work on fragmented care, which is the Conti Center grant that she's part of right now, the center grant that she's part of right now, on how fragmented care might impact well-being. And that's a mixture of looking at human work and also animal models. And then a current project on testing whether if depression is successfully treated during pregnancy, what the benefits are not only for the mother, but also for the infant. So I will turn it over to Dr. Davis to tell you about her work that she's going to present today.
Great, thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for, I'm sure all of you like me spend way too many hours on Zoom, so I appreciate you taking the time to join us tonight to participate in this talk series. And we've had the opportunity, as Sarah mentioned, we have a number of different cohorts that we've been working with and have had the opportunity to work with these families to try to understand not just the impact of this major pandemic on mental health at various phases of the lifespan, but also to try to think about what factors may be protective and promote resilience, and to try to understand that despite all this, there actually are some things that are going well, and that might be something that we can talk about at the end. So I'm going to present data from 3 of our cohorts, trying to understand how the pandemic is impacting mental health at various stages of the lifespan. So we're all keenly aware of the impact of this pandemic on morbidity and mortality, on causing an economic crisis. And as Jenna began to tell us on mental health, and there have been quite a number of sort of cross-sectional studies showing that there are increases in anxiety and depression and other mental health problems in the context of this pandemic. Because of the work we do with longitudinal cohorts, we have the opportunity to look at changes in response to the pandemic. So how, using prospective designs, how families or children were doing before and during the pandemic. And this provides a unique opportunity to think about things that may be protective in the context of this major stressor. So I'm going to today briefly present data from 3 of our cohorts to ask about whether there are shifts in mental health trajectories as a result of exposure to this pandemic. And thinking about these 3 sensitive windows, we'll study 3 cohorts: preschoolers, adolescents, and new mothers. These are pregnant and postpartum women. And looking at, in these 3 phases of the life, when we see these are so sensitive periods when there may be increased vulnerability to emergence of psychopathology, when the context of exposure to stress may be particularly profound. What are things that may be protective against these negative mental health outcomes? So I'm going to start talking about our preschoolers, and with these kids, we were able to ask how the pandemic impacted preschoolers' mental health, and then what are things that families may be able to do that are protective. So briefly, this is a cohort of 169 mothers and their preschoolers. The kids were about 4 years of age when we assessed them. This is a pretty racially and ethnically diverse sample. 46% of our children were Latinx. These are families that also face economic challenges. So 61% of the families in this cohort had incomes below the living wage. And at least 50% of them had at least one parent who was an essential worker. In terms of context, these families were assessed very shortly after the shutdown. So this was really in the heart of when the country was closed down and people were sort of experiencing the impact of remediation to reduce the spread of the virus, and in the form of sort of social isolation. So 3 studies I'm going to be presenting today are measuring impacts during the time of the shutdown, when the impact of social isolation might have been particularly profound. When we look at these preschoolers, we looked at both internalizing and externalizing behavioral problems. The graph I'm showing you here is only externalizing behavior. What we see is that there were pretty dramatic increases in rates of externalizing behaviors, and very few mothers reported that behavior problems were decreasing during this context relative to before the pandemic. In fact, when we look across these externalizing behaviors, things like temper tantrums, fighting, arguing, we see that 64% of mothers were reporting increases in at least one of these behavioral categories. And when we looked at the children in this cohort, we found the internalizing problems of the children in this cohort, we found that about 54% of them were above a cutoff that indicated that they should be screened for evaluation for clinical depression. So these kids were exhibiting pretty significant elevations in mental health problems. This obviously raises high concern, and many families have asked us and have been wondering what are things that can be done to help reduce the stress on children and improve mental health. One of the things that we found to be really protective for preschoolers, for these young children, was maintenance of family routines. So families who, in the context of this extreme stressor, were able to maintain regular day-to-day routines, and this is consistency in daily activities, consistency in bedtimes, things like that, those children were less likely to show increases in internalizing or externalizing behavior problems. So one of the things that I think is really promising about the study is that this suggests a really concrete option for families trying to figure out ways to help their children deal with what is clearly a major stressor. So in this context of kids experiencing extreme challenge, although we are seeing pretty alarming rates of internalizing and externalizing problems, we are seeing that there is some evidence that family routines are protective in benefiting mental health outcomes for these kids. So those are our data from our preschoolers. As I move forward in the lifespan, I'm going to talk a bit about our adolescents. And in this study, we're able to assess the teens' self-report of their responses to the pandemic. Again, this is a prospective cohort that we had been following. So we had data on these children reporting on their own mental health prior to the pandemic, and then we interviewed them again during the pandemic to look at how they were responding. We also, in these kids, asked them about things that we suspected might impact how they were responding to the pandemic. So we asked about their internet and social media use, their social relationships, especially with peers. And then we looked at health behaviors, including sleep patterns and physical activity. So to give you a little bit of a sense of who these children are, these are kids who are close to 17 years of age. Half of them were female. Again, pretty racially and ethnically diverse sample. We did have a fairly wide age range of kids. So you can see what school they were in at the start of the pandemic, ranging from middle school to college. In all of these kids, we measured their changes in depression symptoms from before the pandemic to during the pandemic. And what we saw was fairly striking. So we had prospective data collected on their depression symptoms prior to the pandemic, and then we measured them again during the pandemic. And what we're seeing is a dramatic increase, but really alarmingly among the girls in our sample. So girls are showing profound increases in depression symptoms relative to their levels prior to the pandemic. And just of note, this association did remain after considering things like age, the time between the two surveys, the pre-COVID survey and the COVID survey, and even after considering their levels of symptoms prior to the pandemic. So we're seeing pretty profound increases in depression symptoms, and that these were pretty significant, especially among girls. Next, we looked at what factors might be resiliency factors or protective factors. Starting with health behaviors, we did see that for both boys and girls, better sleep quality and fewer sleep disturbances was associated with less of an increase in depression. So better sleep behaviors, better sleep routines seem to be protective against this increase in depression symptoms. Further, for both boys and girls, better peer relationships and less loneliness was associated with less of an increase in depression. So again, kids who are able to maintain those peer relationships, even in the shutdown, even in the context of social isolation, this was protective for their mental health outcome. Media use was a bit more complex, and this is one of the things that we're following up on in our subsequent surveys with these kids. We did see some evidence that for girls, social media and video game playing was associated with increases in depression symptoms. This was not the case for boys. So for boys, we did not see any evidence that either video game use or social media had a negative link to depression. And anecdotally, in some of the responses boys gave us, we had some evidence that actually boys may be using video games as a form of social interaction with their friends. And so there may be some benefits that we will explore in the future. But it does seem like that this is an area where boys and girls may be differentially using things like video games as to socially interact with their peers. We did see some evidence for boys that media time, things like web surfing, was associated with depression symptoms. But again, the links with media use were a little bit less clear than the links between health behaviors and interpersonal relationships. To summarize, we saw that pretty profound increases in mental health challenges, depression symptoms for girls during the pandemic, and some evidence that loneliness and sleep disturbances may be driving these changes. As parents and practitioners want to think about ways to help teens navigate this stressor, I think these data really suggest that figuring out ways to safely interact with peers and to have social support is really important for kids' mental health, as well as ways of regulating sleep and ensuring sufficient and regular sleep is also protective. The last cohort I wanted to talk about as we think about impacts of the pandemic on mental health at various life stages is in our cohort of new moms. So we have been prospectively following a group of women recruited early in pregnancy, and then we continue to assess them and have followed them up specifically to measure their response during the pandemic. These are women participating in our study that we call the CARE Project. For those of you who are familiar, I'll make a quick note that these are women not in the intervention arm of this study. We do oversample in this study for women who are experiencing elevated depression symptoms. So at the time of recruitment prior to the pandemic, we do over-recruit or oversample women with elevated depression. Again, this is a fairly economically high-risk sample. We have 40% of the women in the sample living below the federal poverty line. So this is a sample that is experiencing some of the economic stresses pretty significantly. Because our design is a little complicated, I did for the sample put together a little timeline. So we recruit all of the women early in pregnancy, and we have measures of their mental health at the time of recruitment. We then continued to assess them. And so then we also looked at their sort of proximal or pre-COVID assessment, and then assessed them again during the time of the shutdown for their COVID assessment. So we have 3 time points on these women. And what we saw was that, as you may remember, we did recruit women who were experiencing elevated depression. So they do have higher levels at the time of recruitment early in pregnancy. Levels were on average going down prior to the pandemic. And then what we see is this kind of alarming increase during the pandemic relative to their proximal pre-COVID assessment. And in fact, 35% of the women were reporting clinically significant levels of depression symptoms during the pandemic. I'm only showing you data from depression here. We also see that pretty significant increases in anxiety. And in fact, that seems to be even more profound than the effects of depression. Perhaps similar to the data I showed you with teens, we're seeing that social relationships seem to be really important for protecting against the impact of the pandemic. So those women who are experiencing more loneliness, less social support during the pandemic, are showing greater increases in symptoms during the pandemic relative to prior to the pandemic. So again, these are data suggesting that new mothers are experiencing increases in depression symptoms during the pandemic. And in fact, 35% of them are releasing clinically concerning levels, that we see social support as possibly a factor that may be mitigating or reducing the mental health impact of exposure to the pandemic. And that's for our moms, but I think overall, these data suggest that although we are seeing mental health consequences of the pandemic, there are several themes that emerge as protective factors. So things like social support across the lifespan seem to be really important, especially in the context of this stressor, as well as maintenance of routines. So daily routines and sleep routines seem to be really protective in terms of reducing the negative impact. For us, one of our really next steps that we're really excited about is, as I mentioned, our sample of pregnant moms. These are women who are part of, we are also recruiting women who are participating in an active intervention. I didn't show you those data today because we're maintaining blindness of our trial. But the intervention that we had ongoing prior to this pandemic was an intervention designed to improve interpersonal relationships. And so one of the questions we're really excited to be able to answer in the future is whether women who are experiencing or participating in the active arm of the intervention, who are receiving interpersonal psychotherapy, are protected against the negative impacts of the pandemic. And given the data I've shown you about the importance of interpersonal relationships and social support, we are hopeful that this may be sort of an added protective benefit of our intervention that we, of course, did not imagine at the start of the trial. This is highly collaborative work, and so I do really want to acknowledge the large team of collaborators that have participated in the study. The pregnancy study, the last study that I showed you, was led by students here at DU, Sarah Perzow and Ella Pyle. The first two cohorts, adolescents in the preschool cohort, are in collaboration with my colleagues in California, Kurt Salmon, Laura Glynn, and Sabrina Liu. With that, I'll stop and I think take any questions that you may have.
I'll ask a question while people are typing.
Great.
I'm curious, did you also collect these measures in the intervention arm?
Yes, so we collected the measures on everybody because it's a blinded trial. We're not able to peek at those yet, but that is something we're really interested to look at because we would hypothesize based on the data showing the importance of sort of having high quality social relationships that that might be protective. In fact, that's what we're hoping, that we'll see that this intervention focused on interpersonal relationships and improving quality of interpersonal relationships may be really protective in the face of this stressor that really leads to increases for many people in social isolation.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I'm wondering, was this like a normal planned data collection time point, or did you have to?
No, so the first two were normal planned data collection times, and then we sort of rapidly after the shutdown sent out a survey. So that COVID time was sent out to everybody with COVID specific questions. I don't see any questions, so I don't know, happy to answer any. It's very funny, as Jenna said, giving a talk when I can't see anybody. So happy to answer any questions.
Okay, you can still ask your questions at the end if you want to think about them. And if it's hard to remember during this pressured 5 minutes, feel free to type in the chat box anytime you think of it. It's okay. We'll just ask Kim and Pete to ignore the Q&A while you're trying to present your data, and then we'll come back to this. I know sometimes it's hard to do it online. Great, thank you so much, Alicia. That was really interesting. I'm going to introduce now Dr. Kimberly Chu and Dr. Peter Sokol-Hessner, who are going to do the next presentation on some work they've done collaboratively. Both Dr. Chu and Dr. Sokol-Hessner are assistant professors at the University of Denver. Kimberly joined us from Duke, where she did her postdoctoral training, and before that from WashU in St. Louis, where she did her PhD work. Both Peter and Kimberly have really fascinating research, and both are folks that have a number of different kinds of projects that they're working on, and using really an interesting range of methodological approaches. Both of them do work that is typically done in person. So the shift to COVID-19 research during this incredible time is in and of itself a reflection of their resilience, something especially notable in our assistant faculty. And Peter joins us from most immediately from NYU, where he was a postdoc. Before that, he was also a postdoc at California Institute of Technology, and he did his PhD training with a different person at NYU before that. So I guess, although I know him as a very outdoorsy person, he's got some definite city time in his blood. I look forward to hearing about the work that Dr. Sokol-Hessner and Dr. Chu have completed together alongside their trainees, which I see they have pictures of here. And it looks like, Pete, are you going to talk first?
No, Kim is going to lead us.
I'm actually going to talk.
All right, go for it.
All right. Thanks so much, Sarah. Peter and I are really excited to share this new project with all of you. This is work done in collaboration with colleagues in the psychology department here at DU, Haley Brooks and Chelsea Pan. And as Sarah noted, both Peter and myself tend to use experimental methods to examine relationships between cognition and affect, but the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic presented the opportunity to think about these relationships and investigate them in a real life setting that's very relevant to all of our lives. So I want to focus in this talk, let's see here, I'm trying to control Peter's screen. So I want to specifically focus on this point in time in March 2020, a few months ago now, where COVID-19 arrived and exploded in the United States specifically. And so you can see in this graph, over the course of that month, US-based COVID-19 cases skyrocketed from less than 100 to almost 100,000 over the course of March 2020. If you think back to the spring now, a number of different events happened. There were states of emergencies in a number of different states, followed by a national state of emergency that was declared mid-March. Schools and businesses closed, the stock market dropped, stay-at-home orders were enacted, unemployment skyrocketed, so on and so forth. And so you can think about this specific window in time in particular. The pandemic has had, ongoing events over the course of the past months, but specifically in the spring, the emergence and spread of COVID-19 in the United States during this time and its repercussions for health, safety, and the economy, they represent a national level stressor that we can think of as unprecedented in recent decades. And so this was something that from a scientific point of view, both of us were very interested in, because we are interested in thinking about how emotion and stress affect cognitive performance, but we typically look at this either using experimental methods in the lab or looking at reports from people's experiences of chronic stress experienced over the course of longer periods in their life. So we know from previous literature that stress can affect the mind and brain. We are specifically focusing in on a couple of domains here, looking at people's risky decision-making, the way that they make decisions about risks versus probable outcomes, as well as the way that they control their cognitive behavior, thinking specifically about this balance between cognitive stability and flexibility. And work has been conducted looking at inductions of acute stress that have shown inconsistent results, surprisingly, in terms of effects on decision-making, where risk-taking has been shown to both increase and decrease, as well as not significantly change as a result of stress. There have also been mixed effects on cognitive flexibility under these kinds of acute stressors. Under chronic stress, there have also been mixed effects observed on risky decision-making, whereas chronic stress in general seems to lead to a decline in cognitive flexibility. But something really important to keep in mind with this prior literature is that we still know, given these mixed results, we don't know that much about the effects of stress in these cognitive domains, and the evidence that we have is inconsistent. This might be because of the kinds of inductions that we're using in the laboratory. This might be because of the way that people are experiencing chronic stressors. There might be a lot of variability there that's affecting their downstream cognitive performance. But given these results, we were really interested in looking at the effects of COVID-19 on a national level, the emergence specifically of the pandemic in spring 2020 as a natural experiment to study the impact of an intense acute stressor with arguably unprecedented scope and intensity on cognitive performance on a national scale. And this is important both in terms of understanding how stress and emotion affect cognition, as well as, given the effects of the pandemic and the fact that we're still experiencing it, how does this affect our downstream behavior and what does that mean for policy? Peter.
Excellent. So when thinking about how to collect data for this particular project, one of our main goals was we wanted to sample widely. So as you may recall, COVID-19 did not emerge everywhere at once. It was very uneven at the beginning. You can even note the log scale over here. It was very uneven at the beginning. This is COVID-19 prevalence, documented anyway, on March 27, 2020, throughout the US. And so we designed our study so that we could sample all across the entire country, and we did indeed accomplish that. So we enrolled people from all 50 states and a total of 269 counties. Some of these counties obviously are very large cities. For instance, the city and county of Denver is one county. So we had multiple people in some counties, but we did reach our main goal of being able to sample the entire country and, by extension, different levels of the pandemic because it was so uneven nationally. We additionally had to handle this idea that COVID-19 was changing really quickly. It wasn't a static thing. That's the nature of an exponential after all. So we collected data in two 20-day phases. The first of these 20-day phases began on March 27 and continued through April 15. And every single day, we enrolled 28 participants from all across the country. When you add that up over 20 days, that's 540 participants total. For phase 2, we then took all those people from phase 1 and we invited them to come back and do the exact same study in the same order as we invited them and enrolled them in phase 1. We had a total of 355 participants come back, so that's about 2/3 of our sample returned for the second phase. And so this helped us accomplish our goals of measuring the same people multiple times, which gives us the ability to see how they change, as well as observe the pandemic progression over the course of a total of 40 days. I should mention this was a mammoth effort to do this every single day for 40 straight days without a day off. And that's entirely Haley Brooks, one of our collaborators on this project. She did amazing. So with these as our main sort of collection goals in mind, our central goal was to understand and measure and quantify how the stress of the pandemic and pandemic events would change how people felt, acted, and thought, both within and across people, to capture within-person changes and across-people changes. Now, our expectation going in was that both local and national or global events like COVID cases would influence how people felt as measured through a variety of affective measures, including measures of anxiety, stress, loneliness, and perceived impact of the pandemic. As well as cognition. And we measured cognition in this case in two main ways. The first was using a risky decision-making task that I've worked with extensively, It is an incentivized choice task that measures both risk attitudes and the dynamic effects of risky decision-making. And then we used a gold standard cognitive control paradigm called the AX continuous performance task, which Kim will tell you about in a bit, that basically measures people's ability to control their own mental processes, to allocate them where and when they want and need to. When measuring affect, we had 4 main measures that we focused on. They were state, trait anxiety, loneliness, and chronic stress. State anxiety was measured with questions like this, asking about how calm or relaxed people felt right now. Trait anxiety was a bigger picture. So I'm generally feeling pleasant. I am cool, calm, and collected. Loneliness was assessed with questions like this. I feel starved for company, for example. And then chronic stress, lastly, asked about stress over the past month. So in the last month, how often have you found that you could not cope with all the things you had to do? For these measures across the different phases, for state anxiety, you'll notice that we actually had a small decrease in state anxiety. We started with a mean of about 44 and it dropped to closer to 42. We had similar numbers for trait, anxiety, loneliness, and chronic stress. When we actually test these against one another to see how they changed across our 2 phases within participant, we see that 2 of them are significant and both of these are decreases, which was consistent in our minds with adaptation. The idea that people were sort of getting used to the pandemic by the time that second phase rolled around. It's worth noting that these scores are slightly elevated from what we would otherwise expect. In particular, state anxiety scores over 40 have been suggested to indicate clinically significant anxiety symptoms. So both our state measures and it turns out our trait measures as well were slightly elevated, which makes sense given what was going on at the time. Now, in looking at these particular measures of affect and trying to understand how they changed and who was experiencing these various levels of stress and anxiety, we ran a regression accounting for pandemic intensity, the experimental phase, the day, and age. And age in particular stuck out and was incredibly strong. It's worth noting that because of our national sample, we did have a relatively age representative sample, obviously on the younger end, but we did have people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so when we account for this, we find that with increasing age, our participants have lower scores in state and trait anxiety, loneliness, and chronic stress. So in a sense, age appears to be affectively protective in this case. Now, we measured a number of other things as well. We're not going to get into any of these today, but just to give you a sense for some of the things that we have the ability to do and will be doing in the days to come. We measured how much contact people were having with other people, both before the pandemic and after. We measured their subjective perception of the pandemic and pandemic events. We, of course, collected a variety of demographics, including socioeconomic status, and we collected their current state and county location so that we could eventually tie their cognitive performance to very local events. Now to move on to one of our 2 main behavioral tasks, we had a risky decision-making task. In this task, you are shown a safe and a risky option, and you have to choose between them. When you choose this risky option, you're then shown, say, the outcome of that option. In this case, you won $25, great job. That's a good situation. This is what we would call one trial, and each participant completed 119 of these every time they enrolled in the study. And these trials were sequenced, so it would have one trial and then would have the next trial and the next trial, and so they sort of happened in a sequence like this. Just to give you a sense of the scale of this study, note that that number of trials, 119 trials per participant per visit, means that we have just over 100,000 choices from all of our participants across both phases in this study. So this data set is a truly enormous data set, very large, very powerful. Just to give you a sense of a couple of the course measures we had for decision making, what we're going to be looking at here is the probability of gambling or taking a risk as a function of phase, first phase versus second phase. And when I plot this, you'll see that the probability of gambling was higher in phase 1 and actually dropped. People got a little more conservative and they started avoiding risks in the second phase. And this was a significant effect using a paired sample t-test. Now we could break this down a little bit further by taking into account some of the things we knew about our participants, and in particular, how they perceived their risk of due to the COVID pandemic. So we asked them, please rate the overall level of risk to you personally that you perceive from the COVID-19 pandemic. And when we do a regression accounting for the items people are choosing about, as well as their personal COVID risk perception, we find not only the expected effects of the dollar amounts they're considering, the risky gain, the safe alternative, and so on, but we find that their subjective perception of risk during this pandemic was a strong predictor of risk-taking in a negative direction. And in fact, it predicted a 20% reduction in risk-taking, which is pretty sizable. So moving on to our next task, we have Kim.
Thank you. So the second task that we looked at in this data set is called the AX Continuous Performance Task. And this is a Q-probe cognitive control task where different trial conditions allow us to index the balance between cognitive stability and flexibility. So just walking through this quickly, participants will see a combination, a Q and a probe, and instructed to press a target response to that combination. It occurs at a high frequency, which sets up an expectation when you see either an A or an X that you're going to make this target response. This allows us to look at the balance of control in two other trial types. The first being what we call an AY trial, where it's the same Q once again, but then a different probe following, as well as BX trials, where there is now a new Q, but it's followed by that high frequency probe once again. When we see strong performance on these AY trials, we think of that as indicating greater cognitive flexibility, because people need to overcome their expectation to the Q in order to flexibly respond to the combination. When we see strong performance on BX trials, we think of that as indicating greater cognitive stability, because people will be expecting to make a non-target response. They might be slipping up when they see this high frequency probe. So we're using performance on these two trials specifically together to calculate a composite measure called a proactive index, which allows us to quantify the relative balance between cognitive flexibility and stability in participants' performance. And so I'm just going to show you a first look at some data that we have from that. So higher numbers here on this proactive index are indicating greater cognitive stability, and lower numbers are showing us greater cognitive flexibility. You'll note that most of our participants have a metric that is above 0, so they are a little bit more stable than flexible. This is pretty typical of what we see in a healthy adult population, particularly younger adults, which even though we have a lifespan sample, our average age was in early 30s. So this is pretty standard for what we see in the task. We do not see a significant difference in participants' cognitive control performance from one phase to another, but we are continuing to probe this and see how it's potentially shifting as a result of the other metrics that we have as predictors in our data set. So just as some takeaways from this first peek at the cognitive performance here, what we saw in both tasks is that participants were engaged and performed well with task performance that's consistent with what we've observed in the laboratory, as well as other groups have seen in these tasks. We saw that affective states were elevated and dynamic. So we saw, not surprisingly, participants reported elevated anxiety relative to norms during the COVID pandemic, but we did see a decrease from phase 1 to phase 2 that we think is basically suggesting people might be getting used to the pandemic relative to early March. We saw that cognitive control remained relatively consistent across time. And we did see also that some of these metrics of state and anxiety were not associated with robust changes in cognitive control. But interestingly, risky decision-making might be sensitive to pandemic events, with higher perceptions of risk associated with decreased task risk-taking. So we are excited to continue to probe this, looking at additional measures from our tasks. And with the information that we have from our data, we have a wealth of additional predictors that we can explore. We can use our geographic data to look at epidemiological measures and pandemic progression. We're also really excited to look a little bit more at the effects of isolation and contact measures and demographics and socioeconomic status, and how that might be impacting affective state and then downstream cognitive performance. So we just want to again thank our collaborators, Haley Brooks and Chelsea Pan, the Provost's Innovation Fund and the Psychology Department for supporting this work, our 2 labs and our research trainees, and we thank all of you for your attention.
Great, thank you so much. Let's see. I think we actually have, okay, we have a question in here for Alicia, and one for Jenna, but let's go ahead and open it up to questions for Pete and Kim. Do you see that question?
Yes, I do. So Jenna is saying, did you ask any questions about past stress exposure? I'm imagining that those with more past stress or trauma exposure may have different risk-taking levels when exposed to the acute stressor of the pandemic compared to those with less past stress exposure. Absolutely. The only thing worse than acute stress or chronic stress is both. So when they come together in these cognitive domains, we see really intense impairment. So that's exactly the kind of thing we would think we would see here. We didn't have questions about trauma exposure in the past, and I'm trying to think if we had anything further reaching back than our 1 month back chronic stressor. I don't think we did. We did ask a more acute version, so we asked, how stressed are you today? And so we have the ability to combine that with our 1 month long view back, but we didn't get into more detail for the kinds of experiences that would result in different sort of chronic stress histories. Great question.
All right, why don't we, Mia, can we bring all the speakers back, and maybe we could start with Jenna answering the question in the Q&A for you. So Jenna, you have one in the Q&A and one in the chat, and then Alicia has one in the Q&A.
Yes, so the one in the chat asks from Jill, were there any concerns or challenges that you expected teens to report that ended up not being frequent concerns that they mentioned? So I actually pulled up the paper that we wrote to like look again. And one of the things, I guess we expected that they would report like being concerned about being exposed to COVID or like contracting COVID, especially it was like in May when they didn't know that much about COVID. And, you know, I'm concerned about getting COVID, but I'm also in my 30s. I'm like a little less resilient than the teens. But actually only 1.4% reported that was one of their top 3 challenges. So much less than I would have expected. There were also less concerns about like less socioeconomic concerns than I expected, but you know, maybe that's something that maybe they're in the context of school and they're thinking less about the socioeconomic impacts. And then also a little bit less like future orientation, like worried about like college or things that are going to happen in the future or like important events that they're missing. So future oriented concerns were only about like 4.6% overall. And like seniors reported those concerns at about like 10%. So much higher than like the freshmen, as you would expect if you're thinking about the future. But yeah, only about 1.7% reported like missing important events as being something that was really concerning to them. So those were some of the things that we thought would come up more, but actually didn't come up quite as much, especially compared to like mental health, physical health, and online schooling. And then let me see the Q&A.
Because that's really interesting, Jenna, because we had a similar experience with our teens. They are not concerned about getting sick. Like that was very, very low when we asked them about their risk of exposure. Their concerns were really things with their friends. I mean, we may have a slightly different sample because we did have kids telling us that one of the things that was causing them stress was cancellation of events that they were expecting to happen, that they were missing out, things like prom and parties and things at graduation. But yeah, I think that was one of the things that we found most striking, is that they were not worried about getting sick.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, and it was like they were concerned, like if you asked them, we asked them like explicitly if they were concerned about like missing events, and they would say yes there, but it wasn't in like their top 3 types of challenges. So Okay, then I have one more question. How much do you think desensitization to the pandemic stress could have been playing a role in this? So I think that's definitely happening. So if we just looked at kind of the mean levels of depression during May, then like from the fall, it really got cut quite a bit. So it was like 47% had a depression in the fall, and it was more, or in May, and in the fall it was like 29%, 30%. So it was a much lower rate. So I think part of that is desensitization. I also think that things were a little more open in the fall compared to in May, when they really couldn't go out. And like much fewer students were actually able to go out and do things. Some of them, I mean, a lot of them are reporting that they were doing it anyway, but I do think that desensitization was happening. It will be interesting to see if things get worse and we go back into like a stay-at-home order again, if we'll see increased rates again like we did in May, but I do think that's playing a role.
Yeah, just to chime in, Wendell in the Q&A said there were some indications of acclimation to COVID in Kim and Peter's data. I'm wondering if there were such indications in other data sets. So, yeah, exactly. I was thinking the same. We definitely saw signs of that. And, at some level, we were a little surprised that it wasn't, getting worse, but at the same time, it makes perfect sense. Yeah.
In our data, we ask again, like 2 weeks ago, we asked what their biggest challenges were again. So we haven't coded those data yet, but it will be interesting to see if there are a lot less COVID related concerns and kind of what is going to be popping up. So we have those data, we just haven't looked at those yet. It's a great question.
Alicia, do you want to take the one that came in the Q&A for you?
Sure, and I was going to add one more thing to the adolescents in terms of things that were like positive for them, because I think that was really interesting to us, that we did also give this like opportunity for them to tell us things were going better. And there were a couple things, and now I've seen this in other people's data, that seem to be going well. And one of them is for some of the kids, they really reported benefits to their sleep. So they didn't have to get up early anymore and go to school. And anecdotally, that's what my team would say. But we did hear that reported just in our data. And I have some other colleagues who are assessing sleep in teens and seeing some improvement in sleep. So when we think about that, despite all these challenges, there are maybe some hints that there are things that may be going better. And for some kids who are not having to get up as early as they did, for those 6 a.m. bus rides to high school, that was one theme that we saw, both sort of in the quantitative, but also in the sort of qualitative data that they provided to us. In terms of the moms, so someone asked whether the depressive symptoms were returning to baseline. One of the things that is a little tricky about this, so our first assessment when they're higher is earlier in pregnancy. And so we are recruiting them because they're moms who are sort of at risk for having depression during the prenatal period. We're then following them. For some of the moms, that was several years ago. So that was their first assessment into the study. And then when we look at their most recent to the pandemic depression symptom level, they're much lower. And then what we see is this kind of alarming resurgence. So I'm not sure that I would characterize it as return to baseline, given the sort of life phase changes that are also layered on top of that, but that they're sort of deviating from the trajectory. They were on a trajectory, and we actually have multiple measures on them of going down, and then the pandemic happened, and then we see this increase. And we see that increase is particularly true for women who are, experiencing more of the sort of social isolation that, again, was measured right during the shutdown. But then also women, we measured things like COVID-specific adversity and things that were challenges to them that were specifically resulted from COVID, and that also predicted who was going up. I didn't show you those data. But so we do, I'm not sure that I can characterize it as a return to baseline, but it is sort of concerning that they're back up as high as they were when we enrolled them early in pregnancy.
Peter and Kim, will you take your question in the Q&A, please?
Sure. So this question asked us first, were we surprised in how quickly the increase in anxiety seemed to rebound from phase 1 to phase 2 of our data? And then the second part of that question was asking what we are looking forward to exploring next, given that we have a number of different relationships and predictors to explore. So for the first one, I think I felt personally, I guess, a little bit surprised that from phase 1 to phase 2 that there was this decrease in reported anxiety and stress. But also, I think if we think back to our own experiences, the time window that we got phase 1 at, the pandemic was still very, very new in the United States. And this was beginning in March 27th. So this was less than 2 weeks after, national state of emergency and so on. And so I think over the period of the month following that, I do think that adaptation is really important. I also think that this overall decrease is potentially masking some really important sources of variability. As we are observing as is emerging, the pandemic is not affecting everyone the same way. There are huge disparities in how COVID-19 has affected different communities and different populations. And so I think that being able to probe that a little bit more will help clarify who's kind of adapting to the new normal and who is potentially experiencing, loved ones getting sick and potentially being impacted more than others are. So I think looking at that kind of individual level variability will be really important for understanding what's going on from one phase to another in our data set. In terms of looking at next phases, that kind of ties into some relationships we're really interested in looking at. We have demographic and socioeconomic status data as well as geographic data on these individuals. So I think really leveraging the variability that we have there and looking at individual differences in the relationships will be important. Another thing that I'm really interested in looking at in our cognitive control data, I used a single composite that's basically treating cognitive flexibility and stability as two opposite ends of a spectrum. And we know that they don't necessarily always act that way. So I think being able to get a more nuanced characterization of cognitive performance, separating those out instead of just simply having them as a combined composite measure will be really important.
I'll just echo that really briefly. We did collect quite a bit of demographic data to potentially, hopefully, allow us to get really specific about who we were looking at and what was going on in their lives and the challenges they were facing, precisely so that we could hopefully leverage that to understand better what's going on with them in terms of their affect and their cognition. And just like Kim, I presented a couple course measures from our data set. We actually designed our task to have multiple deep measures, especially around context. We are very interested in my lab in the effects of recent events on subsequent risks. That's something that Haley Brooks, my graduate student, has been working a lot on. And so we designed this to allow us to identify that. And so exploring whether context affects people's sensitivity to the past, basically, is changed under this kind of acute stress is something we're very excited about as well.
Great. It looks like we have a question that might be relevant for at least two groups about adolescents. And then that'll be our last question. If you guys want to take that and then we'll wrap it up.
So this was a question from Pam about that the data that we've showed thus far was, I assume this is for Jenna and I, during the shutdown, and that how returning to school may impact positively mental health. And then whether we're measuring students who need to quarantine for long periods of time during the return to school, whether sort of that evokes anger during the quarantine. So, I mean, I think for us, we are in the middle of a second wave of data collection. So we'll have some of those answers to the later responses. I mean, a lot of our kids are still not back in school, actually. So we are measuring what kind of school they're going and whether they're at home doing remote school or back in person. And so sort of how they're feeling about whether they get to go back in person or still online, I think will be really interesting. So we don't have answers to that sort of second wave of data yet, but stay tuned in another month.
Same here. I don't think we know like at the school level whether they're in school or not, or in some kind of hybrid, but not so much like individual level whether somebody has to quarantine or not. But it's a great question. I'm sure there are a lot of individual differences in the data.
All right. I can't start my video. Mia, could you let me start video? Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna just wrap us up here. Thanks you guys so much for presenting your really interesting work. And for everyone, we also had several other really interesting COVID related projects happening in the department. So we may have to do another round of this and hear more about that and maybe get some updates on these projects. And thank you to everybody for being part of our community. And it's so wonderful to have people visiting. I love, Jenna, that one of your collaborators is on with us, and I hope we get to meet you in person before long. Take care, everybody, and we'll talk soon. Bye.